Mary. Mary came to the throne a passionate Catholic, but queen of a country in schism. Just think how she'd suffered seeing her mother's marriage declared false and herself declared illegitimate at the age of 17. Once Elizabeth was born, Mary was stripped of her title of princess and denied access to her parents. Her mother lived in disgrace and died in disgrace in 1536 when Mary was 20. Now, Mary was offered a pardon and a household to enable her to live as a lady if she would accept her illegitimacy. She reluctantly agreed. In 1544, although still viewed as illegitimate, Henry granted her the succession after Edward. In 1553, she had the chance to reverse the failings of her father, to show that her mother had not been a mistress. To do this, it was important to reimpose Catholicism, and that was her preferred religion anyhow. Protestantism was tarnished with shame for her. So her first act on being accepted as a queen was to erect a crucifix at the base of her castle, Framlingham. But she took things slowly. She had Edward buried in Westminster Abbey with a Protestant service, herself attended a private mass in his memory. She then repealed the act of divorce of her father and her mother. She tried to keep Elizabeth at court, but the two half-sisters grew in distrust, and so Elizabeth withdrew from court. And then Mary cemented the future of her realm as Catholic by marrying King Philip II of Spain, her cousin and son of Emperor Charles V. But that was her big mistake. See, the English were not keen to have their country ruled by a foreigner, and the gentry had gained by the dissolution of the monasteries. They were concerned that their lands would be confiscated and given back to the monks. In 1554, Sir Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion. He was a professional soldier who had served in France alongside the Spaniards in Flanders, and he didn't actually think much of them. He was affronted by Mary's marriage to Philip and raised 4,000 men in Maidstone, but no one came to his side. Perhaps in part due to Mary's brilliant speech, which called for her people's allegiance. So he was put in the Tower and later beheaded for treason. He was taken by some as a martyr to the English national cause. And Mary grew fearful. The Pope appointed Cardinal Reginald Pole, a distant cousin of the Queen, as his legate in England. Mary asked him to persuade the Pope to leave confiscated monastic lands in the hands of their new owners, believing that this would ease the way for the country return to the Roman Catholic fold. Now, some monasteries still in Crown hands were returned to the Franciscans and the Dominicans, but most of the land stayed where it was. In 1555, Mary revived the Act for the Burning of Heretics of 1401. For the time being, Mary's crushing of the rebellion of Thomas Wyatt discouraged others from rebelling. And most churchwardens duly paid out to restore vestments and altars. And if you look at churchwardens' accounts of this time, you can see that. A certain amount of money to people to take the stone altar out, and then a few years later, a certain amount of money for people to bring it back in. See, they hadn't got rid of it, they just put it in a barn, because they could tell that Edward wouldn't necessarily last. They'd presumably folded the vestments up and put them somewhere else as well. But some people resisted Mary, and 289 Protestants were killed during her time. These include Cranmer, who was tried for treason for having supported Lady Jane Grey's cause. He was lent on to renounce Protestantism before his death, and eventually he did so. But as he was taken to the stake, he famously put his right hand in to burn first, and recanted his recantation. Thus he became a martyr to the Protestant cause. Other Protestants fled abroad. At first, Mary permitted this, but then she got scared and stopped people sending them money. Pamphlets started to circulate against Mary's authority, including John Knox's trumpet blast against the monstrous regiment of women. Anyone found in possession of these books were put to death without trial. Resentment and rebellion was growing. Mary failed to have a child, and her husband Philip II took to spending more and more time abroad. And a failed venture in France ended with him losing Calais. The English crown no longer had it, and Mary said that when she died, you would find Calais engraved on her heart. And die she did, without a child. And so her sister came to the throne. Now, like Mary, Elizabeth had had a tough time in her early life. When it was clear that Anne was no more likely to give him an heir than Catherine, Henry grew tired of her and accused her of incest and had her imprisoned in the Tower and then beheaded. Now, that was Elizabeth's mother, and she, like Mary, was out of favour with her father. And when she was 20, Mary became queen. Elizabeth was the focus, although not the cause, of many plots against Mary, and so Mary had her imprisoned in the Tower. Elizabeth was scared, not knowing what had happened to her mother. Knowing what had happened to her mother, and so refused to enter. Spent several hours in the rain before she was persuaded to go in. And when Mary thought herself pregnant, and therefore Elizabeth less of a threat, she was placed on house arrest at Hatfield. And on Mary's death, she was proclaimed queen, since she was named next in line to the throne in Henry's will. Now, her claim to be monarch depended on her mother's marriage being genuine. So she was wedded to the idea of the monarch as the supreme in the English Church. Under Elizabeth, the form of the Church of England was clarified. With her coronation, the Protestant exiles felt able to return and encouraged Elizabeth to move the Church fully in line with the Continental Reformers. April 1559, a new Act of Supremacy was passed, which made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England. Her brother and father had been known as supreme head, but the bishops disliked the idea of a woman as head of the church. And the Royal Protestant argued the church had one head, Christ. All holders of office had to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen, with refusal to do so being punished by confiscation of property. All of it. In the same month, the Act of Uniformity was passed. Missing church was punishable by a 1 shilling fine, and that's the equivalent of 2 or 3 days' pay to a poor person. Attending Catholic Mass was punished by a fine of 100 marks for the first offence, with imprisonment after 3 offences. Assisting at Mass could lead to life imprisonment. The Prayer Book of 1559 was to be used in all services, but this retained some significant aspects of pre-Reformation worship: the use of vestments, the screens in the church between where the altar is and the choir and the nave. The wording of the prayer book was deliberately vague about the bread and wine in communion. It could be accepted by both Zwingliists, who believe it's a memorial, and consubstantiationists alike. And the Black Rubric of 1552 was removed. Some of the nobility left the country. When they failed to return, they were accused of high treason and their estates confiscated or frozen. Some Marian bishops left the country, others left their sees, and some were put under house arrest. The 39 articles were published by Convocation, which is the assembly of the clergy, in 1563. But most of the clergy got on with it. Only 300 were dismissed for refusing to use the Book of Common Prayer, out of a total of about 8,000 at the time. Some may have held Latin services in private, but many were like the Vicar of Bray, who saw his role as Vicar of Bray as more important than what language he used to lead the people in prayer. Oxford University was the focus of resistance for some, but in time the Catholic scholars emigrated to the continent and then smuggled pamphlets back into England from a base in Flanders. One of these was called William Allen, who was ordained in exile in 1568 and established a house at Douai in France to train Catholic missionaries to England. Among these were Edmund Campion, who, although ordained deacon under the English order, had scruples and left for the continent. He joined the Jesuits and trained at Douai. He was ordained priest in 1578 and returned to England to try and reconvert the country. He was arrested in Wantage in 1581 and was tried and executed for treachery. His death caused several others to become Jesuits and to join the work to reconvert England. Other Catholics got round the oath of supremacy by feigning illness or convincing themselves that an oath sworn on a Protestant Bible did not really count. Cranmer wasn't the only person who could cross his fingers while making an oath. And actually the country probably needed these trained and able men for the time being, so no one took too hard on them. In 1568, Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots, fled and sought shelter in England. In the autumn of 1569, some of the northern earls led the Rising of the North, seeking to replace Elizabeth with Mary, the Queen of Scots, and to return the country to being Catholic. But only a small minority actively supported the rebels, and the uprising was put down. In 1570, the Pope heard reports of the uprising, and believing it was supported by most of the people, issued the bull Regnans in Excelsis, reigning in the highest, of course being God. This edict finally and formally acknowledged that Elizabeth had parted company with Rome. It described her as the servant of wickedness and declared her to be a heretic. It excommunicated her and her followers. But most importantly, it declared her to be deprived of her pretended title of queen and absolved all her subjects from any allegiance to her, commanding them not to obey her or her laws. Any Catholic not obeying this instruction was to be considered excommunicated. This bull had the effect of ensuring Elizabeth saw those who wished to remain under the authority of Rome as treacherous. Mary, Queen of Scots, was kept as a prisoner by Elizabeth until 1587, but she was still being used as the focus of unrest. Elizabeth was persuaded to have her put to death. Plots and conspiracies continued, and eventually Philip II of Spain believed he could assert his right to the throne, since he was the previous queen's husband. So he sent an armada of 130 ships, which was outwitted and defeated by the English navy and the wind. This famous victory ensured that continental attempts to retake England for the Catholic Church ended. However, there were still individuals who came to try and retake England for the Catholic Church. As her reign went on, Elizabeth was firmer with Catholic priests who came into the country. After all the plots, they were seen as traitors, trying to win the allegiance of the people for a foreign power. And so, in some houses, you find priest holes, places where they were hidden if people were coming to check to see if anybody who was still had an allegiance to the Pope was being hidden there. On Elizabeth's death, the crown passed to the descendants of Henry VIII's elder sister, Margaret Tudor, whose daughter was Mary, Queen of Scots, and her son, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England. And it's James who has the authorised version made. Just a quick word about Puritans. See, there was a dissatisfaction with the Elizabethan settlement, not just on the Roman Catholic side. There were others who felt the church had not gone far enough in its reformation. They longed for a pure church, free of the errors of Popist religion. These are called the Puritans. The Elizabethan Puritans stayed within the established church, but longed to be rid of the ceremonies which they saw as the remnants of Roman Catholicism. These included signing with the cross at the baptism, wearing a surplice, kneeling at communion. They also questioned whether the Bible supported bishops and argued for a reformed pattern of church government with elders and synods and stricter discipline. Among these Puritans, we have Thomas Cartwright and William Perkins, who led a Puritan group which were in favour with Parliament, and they hoped to achieve changes in that way. Elizabeth I refused to accept Puritan changes, and so their movement faltered. James I was also against the Puritans, calling on them to conform themselves, or I will harry them out of the land, or else do worse. Many stayed and conformed for form's sake. Some became separatists. They believed the Church of England was no longer the true church, and they were called to form separate groups for the pure worship and service of God. In 1581, a congregation was formed in Norwich with Robert Brown, who lived between 1550 and 1633, as its pastor. And they were known as Brownists. They withdrew from the Anglican Church completely, which they saw as polluted. And this is the beginning of the Congregationalist churches in this country. The Brownists were imprisoned and harassed, and many left for the Netherlands. Now, the Dutch were much more tolerant of religious disagreement, and the Pilgrim Fathers, who were led by John Robinson, who had moved to Leiden before taking his followers to New England, that came from there. Now, Brown himself actually eventually conformed and became a Church of England vicar again. And finally, the Baptists. There's little evidence of Anabaptism, that is, being baptized again as an adult, spreading to England in the 16th century. But in 1608, John Smith baptized himself in Amsterdam, having fled there from England, since he was a separatist. After his death, Thomas Helwys returned to England and formed the first general or Arminian Baptist congregation in England at Spitalfields in 1612. By 1638, there are also Calvinist Baptists, and these are called the Particular Baptists. They arose from independent churches who adopted adult baptism. They wanted to purify the church, seeing it as the gathered communion of Christians rather than as an institution. And in time seeing that only believers' baptism really fitted this view of a voluntary association. Independents and Baptists were in key roles in Cromwell's modern army in the Civil War. And they were allowed to be ministers in the continuing established church after Cromwell won. But others chose to worship separately. In claiming the supremacy of the local congregation, the Baptists were seeking freedom from state interference, and they quickly set up a general assembly to help the congregations to support each other. And by 1660, there were about 300 either general or particular Baptist churches. After the Restoration, after the Civil War, there was intermittent state persecution, but with the accession of William and Mary came limited toleration.